Good afternoon and welcome back to another episode of Brain Biology and Beyond. And today we're going to be talking about ADHD, understanding it, the causes and the triggers, and also understanding it from the perspective of helping those around us with ADHD, whether that be students that we teach or indeed people that we know. So to start off with, I've started off with the quote from Edward Hallowell in his book ADHD 2.0. Where ADHD is described as having a Ferrari engine for a brain with bicycle brakes. Strengthen the brakes and you have a champion. And this is a wonderful analogy for ADHD, which is often looked down upon. The brain of the ADHD person with ADHD has got great potential, great speed. However, due to the lack of regulation and the lack of the brakes and control mechanisms and how they're developed compared to a neurotypical person, it is prone to breakdowns and prone to running out of steam and not being able to keep up as long as it should live up to that potential. Commonly reported among people with ADHD are that they feel like they're not living up to their potential, or they're just stopping short or self-sabotaging. And that is partly due to the way that their brain works slightly differently to non-ADHD. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the ADHD and its causes and refresh stuff that we've covered before, discuss the nature of attention and environmental influences on attention, discuss strategies for improving it inside the classrooms or indeed with other people that we know, and also reflect on how this may look in our own lives as well. So while ADHD is a classic categoric diagnosis, we may associate attentional issue and improvement of attention and focus benefiting all students, and many of the things that we're going to talk about today are both applicable for those with and without ADHD, and this is of vital importance, especially in the age where human attention is being impoverished and taken from all angles. This can be read more about within the book Stolen Focus by Johann Hari, which I would strongly recommend, as he talks about many of the different sources of attentional poverty and things that are drawing away from our ability to attention and focus for a sustained period of times, and the negative influences that this is having on our mental health. So a couple of stats to get us started. That the prevalence of ADHD is currently around 5% worldwide, estimated, and 9% within the USA. There's been a dramatic increase in recent years following increased awareness of the symptoms and the effects, as well as reduced stigmatization, although some stigma does still remain. ADHD traits exist on a continuum with three main categories being inattentive, hyperactivity, and impulsivity, all of which can impact on educational and life outcomes. Many people with ADHD often feel that they don't live up to their expectations, but sadly there are many more dire statistics than that, with many inmates in prisons being diagnosed with ADHD as well. These traits are found at an increasing rate within the general population, with attention spans falling from 150 seconds in 2004 to 47 seconds in 2024. Partly this is due to technology and environmental changes. Intentional issues are also related to many mental health problems, as we will discuss, and this is a bi-directional relationship with mental health affecting attention as well. Now, it's important to note that second point there, that ADHD traits exist on a continuum. I'm not saying that we are all a little bit ADHD, far from it, but the traits of ADHD can be found within general population, and people will experience these traits and symptoms from time to time as part of a normal human experience. However, they do not necessarily mean that just because you have, say, an instance of forgetfulness, that you have got ADHD. You do not have the biological differences within your brain, which we're going to discuss in a minute. So please do be careful when referring to that. So looking a little bit at how the brain develops, and we've seen this previously, that our brain at birth is very different from the brain that we end up with, which is a good thing, if you ask me. There is a high amount of neuroplasticity that goes on with pruning of pathways as we learn and develop. And the seats of executive function, which are those functions that control and allow us to plan and achieve things, is the prefrontal cortex. And this is the last area of the brain to develop, typically around 25, although recent studies suggest that it is as late as 32. So the executive functions that I mentioned include goal setting, organisation, cognitive flexibility, working memory, self-monitoring, as well as attention and inhibition. I want us to think of these 7 functions when we're going through this talk, because obviously ADHD has got attention within the name, but is far more than just a deficit within the attentional domain. All of these different domains can be affected to different degrees within ADHD, and this is partly due to the way the prefrontal cortex within the ADHD brain develops. It doesn't develop as well, and it doesn't necessarily wire together to be able to control the other areas of the brain, such as the amygdala, which is involved within the fear response. And as a result, people with ADHD may have issues overcoming emotions, and this partly explains why anxiety can be highly comorbid with ADHD. And we'll talk more about that in a second. So a couple of other important brain networks within the ADHD brain are the default mode network, which is involved in thoughts about the self, as well as the task mode network, which is involved in staying on task and achieving goals. Normally, these work separately and they don't interrupt each other. However, in the ADHD brain, we can think of them about like competing siblings. They're both trying to have a go at the same time and will interrupt each other when not wanted. And that can lead to various difficulties, including procrastination and other such difficulties, as we'll talk in a minute. Another nice diagram, and this is coming from a lecture from Dr. Barkley, who's a leading expert within the field, shows that ADHD is a performance deficit. People with ADHD do know what to do, and they have often great levels of knowledge. However, sometimes there is a gap between that knowledge and their performance, and they end up repeating the patterns that they already know, and that can lead to many of the difficulties in performance and subsequent mental health difficulties as a result, as they feel that they're not living up to their potential. Dopamine is a key neurotransmitter involved in reward and motivation. We spoke about it before. It helps control the activity of the prefrontal cortex and also aids within executive function. It's paramount within the coordination between the default mode network and the task mode network. Dopamine tends to be lower in the ADHD brain. Whether that means there's lower levels of its production or lower levels of its sensitivity, we aren't fully sure. However, it might be a combination of both. And this is where the genetic component comes in. Various treatments, such as medications, tend to increase the levels of dopamine production and response within the brain to help normalize the activity within those networks. And indeed, MRI scans show that the activity within the default mode network and the task mode network seem to normalize very quickly following the taking of medication. And this is lining up with patients who seem to report that following the taking of ADHD medication, that they realize that they actually had ADHD their entire lives. And felt like they were missing out, and sometimes report a feeling of mourning for their former selves. Now, that's obviously extremely disheartening to hear, although very helpful to show that the effectiveness and the quick speed in which these medications can take effect. So how might ADHD affect an individual? Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the different symptoms that may be experienced, and it's important to remember that these symptoms are experienced in differing degrees within people with ADHD. Some people will barely experience them at all, whereas others, they may be quite impairing. And that impairment is the key driver between someone with ADHD and someone without ADHD. Everybody will likely experience these symptoms at some point within their lives. However, someone with ADHD may experience them frequently, and they will have a greater degree of impairment. And that level of impairment is really important within the diagnosis of ADHD. So, in terms of ADHD, the symptoms mainly refer back to that executive function. So people with ADHD may run late or procrastinate, particularly around a task that they don't find particularly interesting or more mundane, maybe data entry or doing the bills. They may struggle without a deadline. One of the worst things that Ross Barkley refers to is time blindness, where you give someone with ADHD a lot of time in the world to get a deadline done, but they'll leave it to the last minute or the last few days beforehand because they don't prioritize as well due to that lack of immediate gratification due to their dopamine levels being deficient within their brain. Poor organisation skills often associated with ADHD, as well as issues with working memory and short-term memory. Sometimes need to go over things multiple times to get it to stick. Again, if it's not something that they're interested in. When it's something that they're interested in, they're more likely to be able to process it extremely quickly. There are also a number of emotional and behavioural symptoms with ADHD, with anxiety being very high among people with ADHD, and this is partly due to the prefrontal cortex not having a strong connection to the amygdala. So that prefrontal cortex we can think of like the brakes within the Ferrari. They're like a bicycle within the ADHD brain. They're not going to be able to stop its speed, and therefore that can lead to some feelings of overwhelm at times. People with ADHD sometimes can have issues with impulse control, and that can affect them behaviourally and as well as socially and lead to stigmatisation as a result of that. And they may have issues filtering what they say and sometimes not always say the best choice of words. Addiction can be more common within those with ADHD, partly used as a coping and compensatory mechanism for their emotional regulatory issues, but also due to the fact that they are craving that stimulation. This can be both substance and behavioural addictions as well. And lastly, there is stigma, which can be both from the external and people around them not fully understanding it, which hopefully this talk helps to raise, as well as internally for feeling like they are labelled and therefore less capable of achieving things as those without ADHD. So I just wanted to focus a little bit about attention and 5 different domains of attention. We've got focused attention, sustained attention, which is the ability to focus for a long period of time. Selective attention, the ability to focus and tuning out on a relevant stimuli. Altering attention, so flexibility and shifting back and forth between tasks, which takes people a long period of time anyway. and divided attention, which is the weakest, with the ability to task, have multiple things going on at once. Now, the brain is not built to multitask in anybody. Actually, we always work best when we are focusing on one thing at a time, despite what our busy lives may condition us to believe. However, those with ADHD tend to have a weaker divided attention, as well as other deficiencies within their attention, as the name would suggest. However, as this talk is about ADHD and focus in people without ADHD, I will be looking at these domains and describing how they can be affected. So many different influences within the environment, and indeed the classroom, if you're a teacher, can affect ADHD, and I'm going to briefly talk about those. So sleep is massively important for mental health in all people, and sleep, when it is deprived, as it often is in ADHD, often difficulties sticking to sleep cycles, can be massively disruptive towards the executive function and lower the effectiveness of their already limited prefrontal cortex. Diet can affect ADHD both positively and negatively. It can be used as a tool to help supplement it. Things like omega-3s and high proteins have been found to be quite helpful. And refined sugars have been found to be less helpful, and leading to massive dopamine crashes following the initial rush. And indeed, people with ADHD are often sometimes craving sugar due to trying to relieve that dopamine. The diet itself does not cause the ADHD, it merely exacerbates the symptoms, although some elimination diets of allergy-causing foods have found mild success comparable to medications in some studies. Exercise levels, massively important to ADHD. Exercise is a great tool. Sedentary lifestyle will not help with ADHD symptoms, and indeed, having exercise, regular aerobic and anaerobic exercise, can be really helpful. Instant gratification, so feeding back into that sort of addiction style. People with ADHD are much more prone to substance addiction, behavioural addictions, and in the modern age, screens become a massive factor. Now, screens are obviously being used massively within the classroom and outside of classrooms in day-to-day life. Things like TikTok and short-form content are often exacerbating the symptoms of ADHD because people are getting drawn in, wasting more time. And this can apply to everybody. People around them can sometimes set them off. Position in the classroom, we talk about people with ADHD not wanting to be distracted, so trying to keep them away from busy displays or the windows, and as well as who they're next to. Home life is a massive driver of ADHD, and indeed there is a lot of connection within the literature about ADHD and attachment, and there is a little bit of controversy, a little bit of debate about how important the early life years are within ADHD. Now, early life experiences are recognised as a risk factor for ADHD, but although the mechanism is not fully understood, it might well be due to brain development. Indeed, we know that the mother's environment before the child is born is really important within that prenatal environment, as well as attachment with the mother and indeed the parents. Now, that's not to blame anything on the parents. Obviously, the parents are doing the best that they can. However, sometimes attachment issues and ADHD seem to have a relationship between them, and we'll come back to that later. Stress is massively impactful towards ADHD, and again can exacerbate symptoms, with prolonged stress leading to potentially depressive symptoms and reduced levels of that prefrontal cortex that we spoke about. The instructional style is very important for ADHD, and we'll be looking at a little bit at that. Screens, as I've mentioned, with the gratification, can also trigger ADHD. And indeed, if someone with ADHD has got too many different tasks or stimuli going on around them, it can be difficult for them to focus on the correct stimuli. They may end up getting drawn into one part of a topic and leaving the rest of it behind, for example. So in terms of strategies that we might use to help someone with ADHD, or indeed anyone who's issues with their focus, would be thinking about the ways of which we deliver content. Now, obviously, these are going to be appropriate at different times. We can't always use them all every time, but we should be mindful of using potentially collaborative approaches where people work in groups and are able to talk through the process first before writing their ideas down. Practicals, where applicable, and storytelling can be very useful to add that hinterland backgrounds and actually hook them, and this is applicable to everyone. Chunking, of course, which is widely used anyway when explaining, allowing sections to be followed by questions to check that understanding, and to allow that constant repetition of the theme. Identifying triggers is extremely important. Obviously, that's going to be on an individual basis. If we're working with people who have ADHD, then, as I keep saying, that's going to be different from the next person who's got ADHD. So we have to be aware on a personal level of what might set them off and how to deal with that. Attention management skills can be taught. This might be using mindfulness and promotion of other healthy habits, such as exercise and a good diet. That might include working with parents or carers of those with ADHD. Allowing brain breaks or rest breaks during stressful periods, and encouraging the use of the Pomodoro technique, which is 25 minutes of work followed by 5 minutes without. Now, that might be difficult to incorporate if you are, say, a teacher. However, you might be able to allow, say, 25 minutes on a task, or a long period on a task, followed by a 5 minute of a more relaxed task where they're not doing so much of the work themselves. Other useful strategies which can aid executive function within ADHD, and indeed are useful elsewhere, include time blocking. So this might be with a to-do list. You notice on the bottom of the slide that I've got a list of things that we're covering, constantly referring back to that, and also including timestamps when giving tasks to allow that person who may struggle with keeping to time to have that sort of imminency there. That's not to stress them out, that's to make sure that they can manage their time better. Repetition of instructions and getting them to repeat the instructions back to you can be very useful to make sure that they understand and you understand that they've got it, what they need to be doing. Allowing structured plans to be produced. Obviously, we want to train them to be able to do this, but to start off with, we may give structured plans week by week of what they need to do for faraway deadlines, such as upcoming exams, and then allowing them to fill in what they're going to do, and then keeping them accountable for that. Metacognitive modelling can be used for all of these things, particularly the planning, but also on short tasks where they're breaking down that big task into small steps, showing that thinking out loud can allow them to better access it. So these are some useful strategies for ADHD and those who may struggle with focus at all. Now, ADHD has got quite a lot of psychological component to it, as I've alluded to, including potential issues with attachment due to potential trauma or difficulties in the home when growing up. As a result, it is thought that rejection sensitivity dysphoria can occur, and this is where people with ADHD may process their perceived rejection or criticism more harshly. Therefore, they means that they are unable to process it as they should be, and therefore, will internalize it and potentially send them on a little bit of a spiral. And this has become a lot more noticed and reported recently within the news. Medication can help with it, as well as counselling and coaching on that person's part. It's also important to try and foster a good rapport and have a secure connection with your students with ADHD, and try and give difficult feedback while using a positive sandwich and using reassuring language so that they don't take it personally, and constantly praise them where you can for when they've actually acted upon that. Now, I'm going to end with the positive aspects of ADHD because it is often seen as a little bit of a label, and indeed many people with ADHD report great benefits when they've managed to get it under control and use it to their advantage to get ahead. Hyperfocus on areas of interest, being highly empathetic, potentially due to feeling misunderstood before and having increased emotional sensitivity, being very sociable as well, great sense of humour, being flexible and actually able to cope with pressure. People with ADHD tend to do well when there is a sudden change. They don't necessarily crave the routine, the mundaneness, and tend to do well when things are not as necessarily predictable as normal. They tend to be fiercely loyal and can be very, very creative due to the way they think outside the box and potentially picking up on things that people without ADHD don't so easily. And people with ADHD often have high energy, and as long as that's managed, then they will thrive. So remember those things if you know someone with ADHD, or indeed yourself has ADHD, that they are great strengths, that if you manage to strengthen those brakes, then you can thrive and be that Ferrari that finishes first in the race. I've got a few references of further reading if you're interested. ADHD 2.0 by Hallowell and Ratey, 2023, fantastic book on dealing with symptoms of ADHD and helping those around you with ADHD. Dopamine Nation, which is talking about dopamine within the brain and alludes to how it's role in attention. The Molecule of Moore, again about dopamine and its roles within various brain functions. Managing Adult ADHD by Dr. Russell Barkley. Scattered Minds by Gabor talks about some of the psychological perspectives on ADHD, which some people disagree with, but there is a growing level of literature that suggests that it's not purely biological, and that, like many other conditions, that there is a psychological aspect to that. I've also put in the links to some YouTube's podcasts that you wish to view if you're interested. Thank you very much. I hope this has helped, whether you're a teacher or indeed someone with ADHD. Or know people with ADHD, and I look forward to speaking to you next time on Brain Biology and Beyond.